Um, Welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to get to hear from our panelists and our panel organizer today. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which Central Washington University resides. It is the historic home of the Yakima people. The federally recognized Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation is made up of Klickitat, Palouse, Walla Walla, Wanapum, Wenatchee, Wishram, and Yakima people. The Yakima people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. So in reflecting upon this acknowledgement, I remember the Taino, that it was them who discovered Columbus, not the other way around. From the legacies of Spanish in the Caribbean to the impacts of current US policies, we cannot forget that colonialism has fractured outcomes. Structural, symbolic, and everyday forms of violence might look different from one community to the next, but we must recognize that the pervasive exploitation yields trauma, pain, and ultimately resistance. And that is what we are here to learn about today. The ways in which Puerto Ricans refuse to accept the pain and trauma of disaster capitalism. To quote Dr. Joaquín Villanueva, we are here to learn about how they resisted the notion of a, quote, Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, end quote. We are here to bear witness to how they pushed back against the continued negligence and corruption of colonial capitalism, how they did so in the wake of a climate change-induced hurricane and a neglectful neoliberal response that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 4,645 people, how they resisted through art, through mutual aid, and through community building. There are lessons to be learned from Puerto Rico's summer of 2019, and that continue to be learned. This panel is part of a series called The Art of Global Protest. It was conceived of by my colleague, Dr. Volha Isakava, and hosted by Central Washington University's Museum of Culture and Environment and the Department of World Languages and Cultures. The Art of Global Protest series has engaged scholars and activists across the world to talk about protest movements in Belarus, France, the state of Palestine, Egypt, the United States, and South Korea. It is generously sponsored by the CWU Office of International Studies and Programs and the Office of the Provost. And now I will ask my colleague, Dr. Isakava, to introduce our panel organizer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting panel on the protest in Puerto Rico, organized by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Elvin Delgado. Dr. Delgado is a professor in the Department of Geography and also a faculty senate chair for Central Washington University. And we are very excited to turn this panel over to him for introduction of this distinguished panelist on this very timely topic. Thank you, Elvin.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank Hope Emerson and Volha Isakava for the invitation and for considering the struggle of Puerto Rico to be included in this series. Today is a very special day because we're talking about Puerto Rico, and I always have the same physical reaction when we're discussing issues about Puerto Rico. When I heard the song that was playing, I get goosebumps, I get very nostalgic. But it is also a great time because I had the opportunity to talk and meet new colleagues to bring into in my circle, one of which is Dr. Joaquín Villanueva, whom I known for many, many, many years and for whom I have great admiration and respect. I feel very fortunate to call him my friend, and I've seen him develop as a scholar to become one of the leaders in issues and topics about Puerto Rico. I am going to also introduce the panelists who are also very important, have provided important contributions in their fields. I just had the opportunity to get to know them just recently in the preparation of this panel. There's going to be 4 panelists, and what I plan to do is to give an introduction for each panelist, and then open the floor for each panelist to speak when we move to the next panelist, I will introduce that panelist and so forth. And then we're gonna open the floor. I'm gonna start by asking specific questions, and then we're gonna open for the audience um, to ask their questions. So without further ado, let's begin. The first panelist today is Dr. José Atiles, who is a visiting assistant professor of criminology, law, and society at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Atiles holds a Ph.D. in sociology of law from the University of Coimbra, Portugal, and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of the Basque Country in Spain. His research and publications focus primarily on the socio-legal, criminological, and political philosophical implications of U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. In particular, his work elucidates how the uses of law and exceptionality, the criminalization of Puerto Rican anti-colonial and political mobilizations, and state violence and state corporate crime exacerbates the unequal and undemocratic condition of Puerto Rico. Dr. Atiles' most recent work has been published in State Crime Journal, Latin American Perspective, Politics, Derecho y Crítica Social, and Relaciones Internacionales, among others. Well, please join me in welcoming Dr. José Atiles.
Thank you, Elvin, and thank you, Hope, and everybody for being here and for the opportunity to talk to you. I think our panel would like to start by providing you with a general introduction to Puerto Rico and so background information. And for that, Dr. Santiago Ortiz, Aurora Santiago Ortiz, will be taking it from here. And then I will be doing my presentation. Is that right, Aurora?
Yes, that is right. I am just trying to see
ahead.
if you can all see the PowerPoint. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay. So this is going to be very, very short, just for those that don't have a kind of an introduction to the geopolitical and geographic context of Puerto Rico. So I'm going to go very quickly here. So thank you everyone for being here. I will introduce myself later on. So under US occupation since 1898, as a result of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico is neither a self-determining nation nor a US state. The archipelago's lack of fiscal and political autonomy, along with local mismanagement, contributed to massive debt accumulation. To offset the deficit, neoliberal austerity measures such as massive public worker layoffs were adopted through legislation. The crisis came to a tipping point in 2016 when the governor at the time, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, announced that the $72 billion municipal bond debt with an additional $49 billion debt in public worker pensions was unpayable. In June of that year, the United States Congress passed the Promesa Law, which resulted in the imposition of a Fiscal Oversight Management Board, or FOAM. The FOAM delineated several draconian budget cuts in the areas of health services, employment benefits, retirement pensions, and education, including massive elementary and secondary school closures. The territory's subordinate political, economic, and social status have impeded pursuing other avenues to economic recovery, including a transparent audit to the odious debt accrued over decades. So that is it for the intro. I will pass it again to Dr. Atiles.
Thank you so much, Aurora. And if I may, I'm going to share my screen as well. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I have entitled my short intervention as Anti-Corruption in Contemporary Puerto Rico. And I will be building on Aurora's or Dr. Ortiz's comment or introduction. And so Ricardo Rosselló resignation as a governor of Puerto Rico in the evening of July 24, 1919 came after more than 2 consecutive weeks of popular uprising in which hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans protested, marched, and rallied in the US, in Puerto Rico, and worldwide, demanding his resignation, transparency, accountability from the public administration. Likewise, This demonstration demanded the elimination of the Puerto Rican Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, PROMESA, and the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board. This uprising was largely based on a series of corruption cases, and that is what I would like to point out today, which were brought to light. These corruption cases were brought to light by the leak of a now famous chat called Telegram Gate. The negligent management of the aftermath of Hurricane Irma and Maria, and the austerity measure imposed by the Puerto Rican government, the FOM, or the Fiscal Oversight Management Board, to address the economic and financial crisis affecting Puerto Rico in 2006. But for the protesters, Ricardo Rosselló was not only a corrupt politician, he came to symbolize a much larger context of systemic social harm produced by years of colonial neoliberalism, economic and financial crisis, and the criminal negligence that provoked the thousands of deaths in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. To be sure, the Puerto Rican summer of 2019 is unique in its socio-political configuration and mobilization strategies, and probably Dr. Adriana Garriga-López and Aurora Santiago will talk a bit more on this matter later today. Nevertheless, it's worth remembering that this is the first time since the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or Estado Libre Asociado, was established in 1952, that is, a governor resigned as result of a governor has resigned as result of the popular demonstration. During the summer of 2019, Puerto Rico experimented with new set of political strategies in which law, as I'll be pointing out later, and legal discourses were not central. As my presentation goes, while law and legal discourses did not play a central role in this demonstration, corruption and anti-corruption discourses were at the center of these mobilizations. My contention is that the summer of 2019 can be understood in a very restrictive sense as an anti-corruption mobilization, but in a broader sense, it symbolized a period of ruptures with the Puerto Rican legal and political practices. This period also supposed the suspension of the repetitive temporality of the state of emergency implemented by Rosselló administration to manage the economic and financial crisis. As I will show, the summer of 2019 embodied as a form of decolonial justice. And I would like to unpack this general introduction to my talk. I'll be doing that by sharing with you a general overview of the legal history, but more important, a general overview of the Puerto Rican state, or the Puerto Rican legal government, or the Puerto Rican government. And as some of you know, the Puerto Rican government, as we know today, was established in 1952 as a result of the Public Law 600 of 1950, which created the Commonwealth, or the Estado Libre Asociado. We also must note that despite that Puerto Rico is still a colony, it has some local autonomy, or some kind of limited democracy within the colonial relationship with the US. In that sense, there are two important laws to bear in mind. One is a transformation of the bankruptcy code of the United States, in which Puerto Rico was excluded from Chapter 9, that allows municipal bankruptcy, or that allows Puerto Rico and other unincorporated territories to apply for bankruptcy. And the other law is Section 936 of the US Internal Revenue Code. This is important because with the elimination of the 936 in 2006, well, it was eliminated in 1996, but it had a 10 years grace period. In 2006, we will see an accelerated process of economic stagnation and crisis, and this will lead to a rapid erosion of the internal state. And that erosion led to a series of austerity measures, a series of disinvestment and wealth transfer, and we will see as well a series of measures that led to the bankruptcy. Since Puerto Rico could not declare bankruptcy following the US bankruptcy code, Congress passed and Obama signed it into law PROMESA and imposed the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, which imposed more austerity measures, more cuts, and more disinvestment in basic infrastructure and other public utilities. At the same time, in 2006, we will see not only the imposition of PROMESA, but also we will see a rapid change of the legal or the jurisprudence of the colonial jurisprudence, if we may. I'm not gonna enter in details, or I'm not gonna provide a lot of details, but within this background of rapid transformation of the local state and its colonial relationship with the United States, we will see also a series of disasters, a wave of disasters, such as Hurricane María, Professor Hope Amundsen already mentioned, a series of earthquakes in January 2020, and now we're seeing COVID-19 pandemic. What is interesting, at least for the purpose of my talk, is that each of these disasters, as well as the economic crisis, has been managed through the declaration of the state of emergency and through the imposition of more authoritarian or anti-democratic measures by the local state. And this is particularly reflected, or we can see practices of resistance to these measures, not only in every instance or every one of the disasters above mentioned, but also this became particularly clear during the summer of 2019 and January 2020. When it comes to the summer, as I mentioned, in a very restricted sense, the mobilization can be understood as anti-corruption mobilizations. And I have identified in this mobilization 3 discourses about corruption. And the first 2 are directed at the US, at the local government, either coming from the US, which is the first colonial discourses of corruption, which were largely used by previous administration, Trump administration, and by US politicians. Then the Puerto Rican government discourses about corruption, which exacerbated in a way the already precarious situation in which many Puerto Ricans find themselves. And then in the context of the summer, we will see what I have called the decolonial approaches to corruption. And in general terms, when it comes to the local state, and again, I'm emphasizing the local state because many of these demonstrations were targeted at the local state or the Puerto Rican state. The local state or the Puerto Rican government developed 3, 4 anti-corruption measures, and none of them targeted or addressed what we will call the corruption of the powerful, or the corruption that was very much embedded in the local politicians and Ricardo Rosselló and the members of his party. And I think perhaps the anti-corruption code for the new Puerto Rico is particularly pointed in that matter, since what we saw is that they developed a lot of anti-corruption policies, but none of them kind of targeted the kind of very tight relationship between the private sector and the public sector, the tax policies legislated by Rosselló's administration for the wealthy and international investors and so forth. So with this in mind, during the summer, what we saw was clear demand for a change in these policies and a clear demand for some sort of transparency and accountability, not only for those who die and for the lack of a relief effort during the Hurricane Maria, but also a decolonial or a critique of the colonial practices and corrupt practices that led Puerto Rico to the current state of economic crisis and devastation. This we saw something very similar during or in the aftermath of the earthquakes that affected Puerto Rico, the southern towns of Puerto Rico. And even though in this context, the demonstrator didn't manage to oust Wanda Vasquez or former Governor Wanda Vasquez, we saw two important symbols there. On the one hand, the number 4,645, or the number of dead in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and also the uses of these guillotines as a critique or as a symbolizing this desire for a radical transformation of the internal government. So in this sense, what we are seeing is a critique that is not limited to the legal or to the juridical discourses, but rather goes beyond and try to redefine not only what the state is, not only what is the responsibility of the state when it comes to its citizens, but also the ways in which we protest, the ways in which we reimagine the future of Puerto Rico. And so with that in mind, I would like to let my colleagues, I think it's Dr. Garriga-López or Aurora, to take it from here. And I'll be happy to discuss these ideas of corruption and demonstration in the context of the summer later in the Q&A section. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. José Atiles. Could you please stop sharing? Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Dr. Aurora Santiago Ortiz, who is a social justice education scholar. Her research focuses on social inequities, particularly at the intersection of race, gender, and colonialism in Puerto Rico, the United States, and Latin America. Her research links anti-colonial, anti-racist, queer, and feminist social movements in Puerto Rico, the United States, and the Americas to community-based participatory action research approaches. Dr. Santiago Ortiz holds a Ph.D. from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico's School of Law, and a BFA in Film and TV from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Her research has been published in Tres Urbane, Revista Italiana Transdisciplinaria di Studi Urbani, Society in Space, and the Michigan Journal of Community Services, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Aurora Santiago Ortiz.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hello again, everyone. My name is Aurora Santiago Ortiz. I use she, her pronouns. The focus of my presentation will be to talk a little bit about the multiple solidarities that emerged during the summer of 2019 protests, as well as the diverse modes of activism present during that time. I will then shift to the afterlives of the summer protests, particularly the people's assemblies that emerged in various municipalities all over the archipelago. These afterlives are also intimately connected to activism and political participation that preceded the summer protests. These political cultures are termed by Jorel Melendez-Badillo and I as infrastructures of resistance that were already in place prior to the uprising. I'm going to be mainly drawing from the two articles that I co-wrote with Melendez-Badillo. They examine the multiple solidarities forged during the period of protests. Diverse actors came together and took to the streets, fed up with former Governor Rosselló's administration, and were particularly fueled by the infamous Telegram chat that Dr. Atiles mentioned. In the chat, Rosselló, his cronies and advisors derided and ridiculed a plurality of marginalized folks in Puerto Rico, hoping for a future Puerto Rico, quote, without Puerto Ricans. What made these protests different from past mass manifestations? Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans have taken to the streets in the past to protest the U.S. Navy's presence in the island municipality of Vieques, for example. Another moment that comes to mind was prior to the privatization of the Puerto Rico Telephone Company. As a young demonstrator, I was part of the multitude of folks marching in the expressway and in the streets. We were mainly folks coming from the pro-independence sector, the unionized sector, and some from the pro-commonwealth or status quo sector. While university students have always been at the forefront of organizing against neoliberal state platforms and policies, in recent years, there have been watershed student strikes that have galvanized and catalyzed other social movement sectors. These sectors were present in the summer of 19 uprisings. Like many Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, Jorel and I were glued to the different Facebook lives and at times watched multiple lives simultaneously. This was not only for the purpose of seeing what was going on, but we also communicated with folks on the ground about police movement and activity. As we watched incessantly, we noted a shift in who were at the forefront of the demonstrations. Furthermore, the multiplicity of sectors manifested in the diversity of protest tactics and repertoires, ranging from children's protest banner making workshops to underwater and paddleboard demonstrations. There were also horseback, bicycle, and motorcycle rallies, as well as cacerolazos, where every night at 8 p.m., people, mainly from San Juan, would bang pots and pans to make noise in protest of the government. We noted which bodies were at the forefront of the demonstrations. Whereas in the past, cisgender heterosexual men were the protagonists of anti-colonial demonstrations, we saw a plurality of political subjects take front and center. The rainbow pride flag in the shape of the Puerto Rican flag waved high during the nightly protests, as trans pride flags were also visible during the uprisings. There is no political freedom without sexual freedom, one chant said. Many young folks were clear in their understanding that state violence against queer, femme, trans, and non-binary folks is tied to colonial governance, corruption, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. As Joni Jackson reported in a Jezebel article, the ball, the dancing, and the looks are part of what queer activists called batería combativa, or combative queerness. Yet, as Melendez-Badillo and I stated in the Society and Space Forum, rage and joy were intertwined. The protests were sites where overlapping cartographies collided. While some spaces in San Juan became sites for queer celebration and balls, others were sites of state violence, where fires raged and police pepper sprayed and shot rubber bullets at demonstrators. Another important presence during the protests were anti-racist, feminist, and grassroots organizations. Black feminist organization La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción had already been organizing and demanding that Rosselló declare a state of emergency to address the alarming number of femicides in the archipelago. Founding member Shariana Ferrer Núñez was active in the student movement, part of those existing infrastructures of resistance. La Core shows us through their protest tactics how gender violence, as Rocio Zambrana tells us, is linked to debt, the housing crisis, racism, disaster capitalism, a shift in protest politics as usual. As I mentioned earlier, as the frontliners of these protests have shifted, the claims have as well. Whereas independence was often the central unifying category of protests, identity politics are salient in anti-colonial movements in the past years. Rather than centering a particular kind of independence, anti-colonial organizing has been around the ways the state, capitalism, and colonialism produce unlivable conditions for the most marginalized and dispossessed sectors of Puerto Rican society. Racism, heterosexism, and ableism are named as present in traditional leftist politics and being called out as problematic within activist groups. The aforementioned groups, although central to the uprising, were not the only sectors that became galvanized during the protests. I've had many conversations about why the summer 19 uprising was successful in ousting Rosselló. I think about conversations around corruption that I've had with family members that supported Rosselló before the Telegram chat leaked. They put political party and statehood status above the knowledge and understanding that the government steals from the people by mismanaging funds, cronyism, and siphoning off funds meant for infrastructure projects, to name a few. But there was a confluence of factors that came together and created the conditions or the tipping point that denied folks from different political beliefs a sense of complacency with what was happening. And while I mentioned that some sectors, particularly the queer community and feminists, were explicit about identity from an intersectional standpoint, I want to add, as that driving force behind their claims, there were others that also viewed the actions of the government as a direct attack on their identities. But in the case of non-politicized and conservative folks, these claims were tied to their dignity as Puerto Ricans, their humanity, and their cultural identity. This was an attack on their moral fiber, on their very existence. Having proof that the government didn't care about their lives, especially after the government's dysfunction post-Hurricane María led to the loss of thousands of lives, fueled folks like motorcycle enthusiast Ray Charlie to join the protest. Charlie was not a militant leftist. Quite the contrary, he is also pro-statehood. Yet he was able to convene many statehood supporters to join in on the protest. The final notable shift that I think enabled the summer 2019 uprising was youth participation. The role of young people who have changed the cultural landscape through the use of social media and other technologies have shifted from a solely class-based politics to an intersectional identity politics, recognizing that racial, gender, sexual, and other anti-oppressive struggles are entwined with class-based struggles. I take the lead from younger people because they are the example for us older folks that have been active in colonial struggles for decades. And I'm hopeful that in these moments where mass direct action decreases, that coalitions are being built based on the understanding that liberation is a collective endeavor. Once the mission of getting Ricky to resign was accomplished, many folks looked towards sustaining that momentum. In August 2019, people's assemblies began emerging in different municipalities across the archipelago. Pictured here on the left is the Ato Rey chapter of the assemblies. I attended various meetings where people created subcommittees to address different political, economic, and environmental policies and legislation that further curtail the rights of the people of Puerto Rico. I moved to Puerto Rico that month to begin my dissertation fieldwork at the University of Puerto Rico campus. Because my scholarly and political interests are inextricably linked, my study sought to understand how solidarity could be built across differences in community-based participatory action research. To briefly summarize, this methodology brings together people from inside and outside academic spaces in a reciprocal and collaborative partnership that seeks social transformation. My students and I worked with community partners that were part of the People's Assembly in Calle and the Ricky Renuncia protests. Many of my students were also participants of the summer uprising, as well as the May Day protests that occur annually in Puerto Rico. There were students and community partners that also participated in the 2017 university strike, protesting the unelected Fiscal Control Board's austerity measures for the public institution, among other things. So as a result of that partnership, the students, community partners, and I formed the Calle Urban Hub Collective, a community organization that sought to occupy an abandoned building and start a community center that provides support to elderly folks, the LGBTQIA community, and survivors of sexual assault, among other initiatives. We are grounded in the principles of mutual aid and solidarity and seek to work alongside communities to promote autonomous organizing. Because of the pandemic, we were unable to open a space, but started a solidarity pantry in July 2020, as you can see on the top right. We set up a tent in the urban hub of Calle and distributed and collected food, clothing, books, and supplies to protect against COVID-19. And now we've actually made that permanent, and we have a pantry in the right wall where we had our sort of tent set up. The work of the collective was inspired in great part by another mutual aid organization in the neighboring town of Caguas, Urbana-Champaign. We visited the mutual aid organization that has a community garden, a gallery, clothing boutique, lodging, and needle exchange program, among other initiatives. Although our collective at Urbana-Champaign did not happen as a direct consequence of the summer 2019 protests, we are part of a broader interconnected network of anti-colonial groups that center collective organizing and fashion alternative futures in the present. Another initiative that I want to mention are the Alacenas Solidarias, or feminist pantries, that also emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic to address food insecurity, which has worsened due to high unemployment during the pandemic. And to the bottom right, you can see one of the murals that they have done. So the feminist pantries are decentralized, yet are coordinated across the archipelago. They use popular education, pedagogical strategies such as muraling, as you see, and community meetings to raise awareness about gender violence and sexism. As you can see in that mural, they have a slogan, Solo el pueblo salva el pueblo. Only the people save the people. This has become a popular refrain in our current context, where the government constitutes a hindrance instead of fulfilling its responsibilities to all. The pandemic and its ensuing consequences have also inactivated many of the people's assemblies. While this may only be one factor that accounts for the dormancy of sustaining political organizing in broader sectors, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, feminist, and queer organizing continues in the archipelago. With time, we will be able to understand in more depth the afterlives of the Primavera de Verano, and the current administration is not a far departure from Rosselló's. What we were able to witness, however, was the collective will of the people done. And if it happened once, it can happen again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Adriana Garriga-López, who is an anthropologist and artist born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Dr. Garriga-López is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Kalamazoo College in Michigan and Associate Faculty of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. She holds a Ph.D. in Anthropology, as well as Master of Philosophy and Master of Arts degrees in Anthropology from Columbia University in New York, and a BA in Cultural Anthropology and Comparative Literature from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Dr. Garriga-López's research has been published in Human Organization, Critical Public Health, Scholar and Feminist Online, Small Axe, Shima, a Journal of Island Studies, Social Anthropology, the International Journal of Infectious Diseases, and New Proposals, Journal of Marxism and Interdisciplinary Inquiry, among others. Adriana is also a poet, performance artist, painter, and soprano. Her creative work has appeared in the 2019 anthology, Puerto Rico en mi Corazón, as well as in Tripwire Journal of Poetics Íntima, a Journal of Narrative Medicine, The New Engagement, Cruce, 80 Grados, Sargasso, Ad Hoc, African Writing, The Columbia Review, Beyond Polarities, and Piso 13. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adriana Garriga-López.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I just have a few slides, and I'm reading also from the same computer, so I'm not going to be able to look at you at the same time, so if something goes wrong, please just shout out and tell me to stop. Okay, so saludos to everyone. This brief presentation represents a condensation of an essay that is forthcoming as part of a book to be published later this year by the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture about the artistic practices of contemporary Puerto Rican dancers and performance artists, some of which I conceive of or interpret as experimental forays into future-oriented feminist, queer, and decolonial heterotopias. And I should say that the editors of the book are Nibia Pastrana Santiago and Susan Omar. very honored to be part of that of that collection. I'm under erasure in this we, when I use the we in this paper, as an anthropologist who studies queer feminist farming veering into art criticism, as a minor artist performing within the same scene I describe, and as a native-born Puerto Rican who is nevertheless also an outsider because I don't live in Puerto Rico for most of the year. But these are not just local concerns. In a sense, both the conundrums and the decolonial heterotopias Puerto Rican artists and farmers respond to and create are of planetary significance because they are emblematic of the Anthropocene. Oppositional artistic labor in Puerto Rico relies on a strong community of artists and savvy artistic counterpublics whose epistemic and material explorations reverberate throughout a significant cultural sector that includes students, farmers, activists, and artists, and the same person can be all four at once. These embodied practices and experiments are connected to larger social movements. For example, dance took center stage at the protest in Puerto Rico during the summer of 2019. I engage these explorations and practices in order to consider how art making and performance generate strategies of resistance based in Puerto Rican culture that act against global capitalism and US American colonial rule. Through their revolutionary praxis of radical autonomy and self-determination, Puerto Rico's independent artists and farmers have been at the forefront of organized resistance to the undemocratic regime imposed by the Puerto Rico Fiscal Oversight and Management Board created by Promesa. Puerto Ricanness has been described as an impossible belonging. This impossibility inspires a series of aesthetic sites disclosing the ambivalent interplay between being disposable and demanding to be wanted, continuously enacting permanent endurance practices to cultivate an existence under colonial time. I'm citing Ruiz here. Only subcultural circuits, according to, this is a citation to Munoz, only subcultural circuits constituted by counterpublics who embrace deviance in the form of queer and feminist itineraries of physical and epistemological movement through shared space seem capable of at least putting gesture or giving body to what it feels like to be Puerto Rican in resistance when words falter and concepts or institutions such as nation, identity, democracy, or freedom seem to fail. Dance and performance as practices of social embodiment create opportunities for nonlinear and insurgent breaks in time-space that can wrest Puerto Ricanness away from the temporal looping created by colonial time and its repetitive historical forms and violent social iterations. Puerto Rican artists were central to the grassroots community rebuilding efforts that characterized the recovery from Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, even while also being profoundly affected by the devastation that disrupted the frail equilibrium of the art scene, with many losing studios, archives, and materials. Their efforts were not limited to the emergency period after the hurricanes, the crisis within the crisis. Rather, on the Puerto Rican islands as elsewhere, artists have acted as epistemic leaders in practices of anticipatory freedom. As a central part of the social process of acknowledging change after the devastating impact of Hurricane Maria and preparing for a future in which such storms may become more frequent due to climate disruption, independent artists and farmers in Puerto Rico have perceived and responded to critical thresholds that others prefer to simply ignore or actively rebuke, and have grasped at, or at the very least sought to grasp, decolonial, queerly heterotopic and biotechnocultural horizons beyond the immediacy and specificity of Maria or any other given crisis. The transformational aesthetic practices of oppositional dancers and performance artists since the second half of the 20th century have created an intergenerational feminist queer dialogue in absolute defiance of the presuppositions of artistic production in Puerto Rico. As elsewhere, this has included an insistence on the importance and investigation of the specific racialized, gendered, and class spaces in which performances and dances take place, but not just in the sense of creating site-specific words or in situ performances. Those modalities are included in the aesthetic repertoire of this insistence I'm describing, but it is less concerned with the formal aspects of site specificity in any given medium than with the possibility of using art as a way to reclaim abandoned, neglected, or marginalized spaces, to increase or decrease the density and quality of social interactions within them, and to make visible marginalized experiences and epistemologies so as to revalorize them. Yet Puerto Rican artists have not limited themselves to a rhetorical critique of white supremacist patriarchal colonial capitalism. Rather, they have formed a creative underground. This creative underground is dedicated to enacting the right to stage oppositional or Dadaist utopias at any time and place, so as to express the distinctly human capacity to conceive beyond reality, to desire beyond adequacy, to create beyond need. This creative underground in Puerto Rico results in an abundance of oppositional performance art and dance that enact what philosopher Pedro Lebrón calls the attitude of marronage. While some museums and cultural institutions support established practitioners, these artistic practices are mostly shared with the public in informal spaces, responding to an urgent need to be shared by using the device of the personal space as the most logical and possible venue, where no government permits or bureaucracy intervenes. Thus reprising in a fresh way the old feminist adage that the personal is political. This subterranean sensibility is shared by other artists who themselves constitute a large percentage of the audience for these works. At stake for both artists and spectators in Puerto Rico, who, as previously stated, are often the same people in different roles at different times, is the issue of whether anticipatory illumination through engagement with the arts can liberate people, us, from alienation and repression. If so, perhaps engaging with dance and performance art can produce an uncoercive rearrangement of desire, as per Spivak, that necessarily transforms participants because it requires a re-envisioning of who we are and the reimagining of the world in which we live. Puerto Rican artists have used dance and performance art to engage with this anticipatory possibility of reimagining the world in order to move toward liberation and away from colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the destruction of nature. What or who is the different Puerto Rico we desire? How can we construct a different future? What does decolonization mean for us today? And what is the role of art and artists in this process? I was witness to queer feminist forms of spontaneous dancing in San Juan during the protests of the summer of 2019. I was there on the 22nd of July as rain fell and massive demonstrations on the Las Americas highway slowed to a crawl. I saw queer dance circles form spontaneously in the rain to dance music blasted from speakers mounted on the backs of pickup trucks. These forms of spontaneous protest dance enact a queer feminist choreopolitics. They do so through their undisciplining of forms of political protest and of the normative subject of nationalist politics, the people, thus refusing their residual lifeways. In these choreopolitics, the people of Puerto Rico who emerge are not the embodiment of the white supremacist heteropatriarchal fantasy of the Creole nation state or the great Puerto Rican family, but are instead a brown, queer, and feminist fragment of the nation, a patchwork of trans, feminist, and anarchist art collectives repurposing reggaeton and voguing on the highway, a small but noisy bunch capable of making an uncomfortable difference in the lives of drivers on the highway, police who show up to repress them, and in the eyes of a broader public who witness their dance actions through media. Protest dance and performance in Puerto Rico are significant means of queer feminist epistemic, anti-colonial, and our decolonial contestation. Strategically deployed through choreographic practices that speak to and express creative forms of utopian disidentification, Puerto Rican choreopolitics lay claim to social and geographical spaces that have been abandoned or foreclosed to ordinary people so as to confront, discuss, protest, negotiate, or transform relationships to them. Making oppositional art as an independent artist in Puerto Rico is an embodied practice and a cultural manifestation of the decolonial ethos. That is, of naming and articulating practices that challenge and subvert the hegemony of modern colonial aesthetics. In other words, of decolonial aesthesis. Decolonizing aesthetics and decolonial aesthesis or poiesis are open-ended processes that require communal horizoning work usually performed by artists on stolen time and always on embattled grounds in a race against capitalism. The future could hold radical departures. For now, let us say that horizoning work is also aesthetic, since it is about designing a new mode of relationality with the natural and physical world, as much as it is about reframing social relationships and scientific paradigms. Artistic communities in Puerto Rico form a performance geography that includes farming and rural solidarity building as some of the ways in which people living in particular locations give those locations identity through certain acts. For example, Puerto Rican dancers, performance artists, and radical queer feminist farmers create, place, and give meaning to ordinary locations by playing with the use of deviant naming or not naming. See, for example, the queer local food cooperative El Departamento de la Comida, which usurps state language. via the construction of the body as archive, through the use of location as part of the practice, and through a vision of relationality as an itinerary of movement. In this way, the everyday practices and itineraries of marginalized people in relation to the space-making practices of colonial capitalism generate residues, excesses, bulges, stains, and traces that populate a substratum of meaning not immediately accessible for commodification, though entangled with consumptive modalities that can be subsumed or appropriated. Creative practices that can reveal connections and stir new modes of perception will allow us to make and be part of cultures that are not just sustaining but actively regenerating the conditions for life in our region and on our planet. In these efforts, heterotopic bodies have shaped and performed a decolonial praxis of humane post-capitalist and post-state speculation, ironically under the very thumb of U.S. necropolitical empire in the 21st century. They have forged events and honed skill sets that can perform embodied horizoning work in anticipation of or for a decolonial future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Dr. Joaquín Villanueva, who is a critical human geographer based at Gustavus Adolphus College in the state of Minnesota. His research centers around urban political economy and has worked in cities like Paris, New York, and San Juan. He's currently working on his first book on the origins of the Puerto Rico Planning Board from 1940 to 1959. His work has been published in Antipode, Society and Space, NACLA, and ACME, among other journals. Professor Villanueva is also the current president of the Puerto Rican Studies Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joaquín Villanueva.
Oh, well, thank you again, and thanks for Elvin for the invitation. Really appreciate to be in your company always. We're friends from a long time, and be with Aurora, Adriana, and Jose. So sorry, I don't have slides, but would like to read you something and put this protest in a larger historical context. So the protest that shook Puerto Rico in the summer of 2019 forcefully created new political horizons in the collective imagination of a people tired of being tired. Today, I would like to briefly contextualize the 2019 protest within a larger history of struggle against imperial, colonial, and political domination. Puerto Rico, as you know, was a Spanish colony from 1493 until 1898. The year when the United States took possession of the territory, never to cede it back to the people inhabiting these islands. In this long history of colonial domination, spanning over 500 years, we lack historical narratives about freedom and independence. Our collective political imaginaries yearn those moments, yet somehow we always return to the questions that keep haunting us. Why did we never gain independence like our Caribbean and Latin American neighbors? Have we not fought enough? Did we not want our freedom? Or are we an inherently docile people? These are fears present in political narratives and collective movements in Puerto Rico, fears that are countered with spectacular narratives about heroic feats. These fantastical historical narratives play an important political role. They prevent us from succumbing to the idea that we are passive colonial subjects. They feed the imagination and give us hope that one day we might be free. The 2019 protests are now part of that limited political repertoire that feeds our collective imaginations. But I want to set it apart and highlight its uniqueness from these other historical moments. Let me begin with a very symbolic and still pertinent political moment. It is the year 1868. Puerto Rico was dominated by coffee haciendas owned by European migrants, and slavery was still a legal institution. Freedoms were lacking. and a group of Puerto Rican rebels led by Ramón Emeterio Betances and Segundo Ruiz Belvis began to plan a revolt from exile to overthrow the Spanish colonial government. On September 23, 1868, a group of rebels took over the town of Lares in the heart of the coffee hacienda economy, seizing many haciendas, stores, and the main plaza. The next day, the Puerto Rican Republic was declared, and almost immediately, Spanish forces rounded up the rebels, subduing the insurrection. Betances, the revolutionary at the heart of the insurrection, now known as the Cry of Lares or El Grito de Lares, pondered about the defeat. He later realized that no freedom struggle would be successful if not actively supported by the local elite as well. Native property owners and hacendados bitterly opposed the Lares insurrection and betrayed the rebels' dreams of a free society, free from political corruption, free from economic exploitation, free from slavery, free from imperialism and colonialism. Nevertheless, the mere idea of a Puerto Rican republic, even if it only lasted less than 24 hours, is very seductive for those of us seeking to be free from colonial domination. Every year, some people commemorate the event, marching like a procession to Lares to remind us that we can be free. Fast forward to 1950s Puerto Rico. The US has ruled these islands over half a century. Puerto Rico is about to embark on an ambitious industrialization program that will fundamentally transform its social base from an agrarian to an urban economy. The Puerto Rican government is now constituted by a renewed native elite that has learned the craft of negotiation, compromise, and technocracy. The political elite wanted development at any expense, whereas other groups, such as the Nationalist Party, wanted the independence of Puerto Rico at any cost. In 1950, the Nationalist Party staged an insurrection in various towns of Puerto Rico, including the mountainous town of Jayuya, where Blanca Canales once again declared the Republic of Puerto Rico. This time, rebels were met with a much more overpowering army, the US military, who launched airstrikes and deployed ground troops to quickly restrain the rebels. The local elite once again betrayed our freedom dreams, siding with the US empire and US capital rather than with the rebels. The Declaration of the Republic in 1950 still serves as an important reference for our freedom dreams. We now move to the year 2000. 100 years of US imperialism have passed, and the anti-imperial struggles are now centered in the island of Vieques. There, the US Navy had set up a training ground in the 1940s, testing with live ammunition in the beautiful beaches of this tropical island. 2/3 of the island had been seized by the US Navy, encroaching the dwindling population to a small strip of land. When in April of 1999, a bomb mistakenly killed a local guard, people from across many political sectors mobilized to demand the exit of the US Navy from Vieques. It truly was what José Atiles has called a common front, bringing together people from different political positions united by one cause. The mobilization successfully forced the Navy out of Vieques, partly thanks also to the support from the native elite and the international community. Betances was right. If supported by the local elite, anti-colonial struggles could be successful. Nevertheless, since the departure of the US Navy, the local elite has abandoned the people of Vieques, now struggling to survive in an island lacking a hospital, adequate transportation, and essential services. Many have been left to die due to governmental neglect. Despite that, Vieques is a key referent in our collective imagination. One of the few moments when we were able to win an anti-colonial struggle by coming together as one people. But we also learned a valuable lesson. The local elite is not to be trusted, which brings me to the present. In the history of anti-colonial struggles, the 2019 protests are quite distinct from the examples I just discussed. Whereas those struggles directly challenged the colonial and imperial forces present in Puerto Rico at the time, they did not properly address the question about the native elite. What is their role in anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles? In 1868 and 1950, the native elite at the helm of the local government betrayed rebels, suppressing their freedom dreams. In 2000, however, the native elite joined protesters, briefly demonstrating the power of a common front in the fight against imperialism. But in the years that followed, the native elite betrayed the people of Vieques, abandoning them and denying them their freedom dreams. That same abandonment was experienced by many soon after the passing of Hurricane Maria in 2017. By the time the summer of 2019 came, the people were fed up, tired of the lies, deceptions, and corruption of the native elite. So when the people took the streets en masse in 2019 to demand the resignation of the governor, they successfully drew a new political horizon for our collective imagination. For over 200 years, we have been taught that the native elite will lead the anti-colonial struggle that will make us politically free. That time has never come. And when opportunities have been presented, the native elite has decided to side with empire. The first step to being free, said Aisha Hines, playing the character of Harriet Tubman in the TV series Underground, is when you can see past all the things that you know and believe something better. In 2019, the people of Puerto Rico finally started to believe that our freedom dreams did not need to include the native elite, that in fact, the elite has been our main obstacle to freedom. The 2019 protests allowed us to believe that something better was possible, that historical reference will be the blueprint for freedoms yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. Now I have a series of specific questions that I'd like to ask, and then we'll open up for the general audience. Let me start with Dr. José Atiles. José, where do you see the narrative of corruption and political debate moving forward in the context of the political status of Puerto Rico, and what's next?
Thank you so much, Dr. Delgado, and to my colleagues. I think we in Puerto Rico we're facing a very similar phenomena that other countries that had anti-corruption demonstration during the past 2 years are enduring. On the one, we can see, I think, 3 big social movement or 3 big social understanding of corruption. And on the one hand, we have seen the emergence of a civil society, series of NGOs, organizations that promote and are working for or developing a certain series of anti-corruption discourses and practices. And these NGOs and civil society organizations are in certain way reproduce mainstream understanding of corruption. They are intertwined, connected, and sometimes funded by the World Bank and by other transnational neoliberal organizations. And so these organizations, although do a really important work, they are not challenging the current colonial dynamics. They want to improve the state. They want to improve the colonial government. And this is really important because they have a really strong presence in the local among local elites, among local, the Criollo blog that Joaquín Villanueva defines, and they're really powerful. So these organizations are something that I've been studying and I'm working on. That, and I'll be going back to those organizations, but at the same time that we are seeing this development of these organizations, which are not challenging the colonial relationship, which are trying to improve the local administration, we have the the emergence of new parties. Some of them are somewhat anti-colonial. They use the discourse of corruption to kind of promote a better type of administration as well, but sometimes they are also critical. And during the past elections, we saw that the pro-independence party got an important amount of votes, or a lot of young and new voter cast votes vote for the pro-independence party. So we're seeing changes in the political spectrum. We're seeing changes in the political organizations and parties emerging. But perhaps the most important series of discourses around corruption are those that are emerging from autonomous organizations, self-convened or autoconvocados or autonomous groups from, as Aurora presented, feminist pantries, as Adriana presented or mentioned, artists, art, and other queer, trans groups. And those organizations, those groups are kind of pushing a new understanding, not only of the role of the state, not only pushing for making the state accountable for the crimes that the state commit, the local state, but also the colonial state, and the criminogenic dynamics that colonialism entails, but also the local administration have engaged with. But they're also pushing a debate about decolonization and kind of freedom that is important to follow. Obviously, as organizations, as the people, as political parties learn, also the state learns. And so, as we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, despite the, after the earthquakes, despite the organization and the mobilizations, Wanda Vasquez and, in a way, Pierluisi were really effective in maintaining their position despite that they were largely rejected and people were demanding to resign. So with that overview, what comes next? What is next? It's really hard to say, right? It depends of whether these groups manage to be at the center of the debate of not only how the state should look like and what the state should do for us, but also what are the possible futures. If we only depend of these NGOs, civil society organizations, or political parties, probably the future won't like very different than what it looks like now. So there are a lot of possibilities there, and I would say that what comes next is pretty open, especially in terms of COVID, in terms of abandonment, in terms of disprotection and lack of basic resources for the people enduring this pandemic and so many disasters. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. My next question is for Dr. Aurora Santiago Ortiz. We have seen many demonstrations and protests in the history of Puerto Rico, like the ones Dr. Villanueva described, many of which took a violent turn. We can think of the La Masacre de Ponce or the Ponce Massacre, the situation in Vieques. What do you think galvanized the 2019 protest and the success to pressure Ricky Rosselló to resign?
Thank you, Elvin. Pues, I think, as I talked about in the presentation, there was a variety of factors that all kind of came together at the same time. You know, the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, people being, you know, going through the situation where they had a lot of family members die, where basic services weren't functioning as they should have been. Most of the deaths were preventable. A lot of them were indirectly not caused by the hurricane itself, but by lack of electricity, by lack of access to being able to go and get dialysis at a hospital, for example. So those factors were there. And then to read the way that the highest in the government referred to the people was like the last drop in the glass that made it kind of tip over. But I also think that previous organizing made this, there was a facilitation because there were already networks, as I mentioned, kind of those infrastructures that facilitated these people coming together. But these infrastructures didn't include everyone else. So I also mentioned Ray Charlie as being a galvanizing figure. The celebrities, to a certain extent, I don't want to give it all to them, but they did, you know, for some people might have gone out in the streets because of that. Having a common goal was something that facilitated that, even though the people that were all participating were very different. And just to be clear, I would say, if not all instances, the violence is initiated by the state and not by the people that are protesting. And I also think technology galvanized. I think that people in the diaspora were able to share and spread information in very quick ways that people that were at the actual protest may have not been able to as quickly, because we had different vantage points where we were looking at the protests, as I said earlier as well, where we were able to share information. So a lot of factors, I think, weighed in. And I also, one thing I didn't mention in what I said, I think, and this is not to take away of the importance of like the agency of people, but I also think that the fact that it happened in late July was helpful, because late July and during this last week of July is kind of a dead month. July anyway, people are on vacation, they're off from school, they take vacation. So I think that facilitated having, and students were out of the university, it facilitated having a big conglomeration of people at Calle de la Resistencia. So I think it was just, you know, all these factors from the chat to previous things, all of that came together and kind of created like this perfect moment where these protests were made possible.
Thank you. We have several questions from the audience, but I would like to finish this ones and then I'll read those questions for the panelists. I would like to follow up with you. It would be fair to argue that the general views about the political status of Puerto Rico are somewhat divided and sometimes difficult to discuss because emotions get in the way and they can get heated very quickly. However, one thing I observed when I was in Puerto Rico during the protest of 2019 was that Puerto Ricans joined as one voice with one goal, regardless of their political affiliations, ideas regarding the political status, or gender identities. What do you think was the glue that linked different views, feelings, imaginaries, and narratives in just that one specific goal?
So I think I'll come back to the fact when this is why I think that the shift has been not necessarily it's not the independence, right? Because you had pro-statehooders participate in the protest. The status became secondary, I think, to what the goal was in the protest. I think that culturally, we're disrespected. Like, we take that to heart. And I think that can happen from a very political standpoint in terms of like your own identities not being recognized or not being or, you know, being violentadas or being negated or being assaulted in different ways. So state violence. So I think that look and the state violence that many after Maria also experienced. So I think that being on the receiving end, how most of the country, except like the economic elites and the political elites, not having to have suffered through what most people actually did, that was a common point of solidarity. And when I say, I don't want to homogenize the people that were participating, that's why I said they're very different. They come from very different backgrounds, but they were able to come to realize this final goal, which was the removal of the governor.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Dr. Adriana Maria Garriga-López. What lessons can we learn from the role that artists played in the protests of Puerto Rico in 2019?
Thank you for the question, Elvin. I think there's many lessons that can be learned. One is the sort of value of doing artistic work and creative work in communities, and the role that art making can play in political conscientización and coming to awareness of political issues, and that was some of the groundwork that was laid before the summer of 2019. So I think that's one of the lessons. Another one is how important play is, and being willing to engage with the environment and transform it. And for example, one of the things Aurora just mentioned was La Calle de la Resistencia, the renaming of the street. And I talked a little bit about this in my presentation, the use of deviant naming practices among Puerto Rican artists. And so you can see that as an example of that as well, the changing of there was actually a new street sign that was created and pasted over the old one, or the original one. And the sort of effervescence of art and the role of the body in the protest is also really significant, in the sense that people use their bodies as canvases for expression. And there was all kinds of creative expression using body paint or costuming, all kinds of different body-centered performances, as well as just the willingness to engage creatively as a crowd as well. That was part of the excitement of being in the protest, is that there was this playfulness about the call and response, the way that the crowd was engaging had a lot to do with dancing. It had to do with this kind of creative effervescence that I think was really a part of what sustained the protest for, people were spending many hours in a situation that was pretty stressful on the body. So there are many lessons that one can learn from that. And of course, el perreo combativo was one of the sort of main events, the use of dance as a confrontational tactic with police power, with state power, with the church, with the Catholic Church, with heteronormative institutions and ideologies, was really central as well. So I think, that was one of the things that made this experience so unique, was just how much creativity was involved in those protests, from music to performance to the graffiti was incredible as well. And it was very ephemeral, because the graffiti would go up at night and then in the morning it would get painted over. So there was this labor of photographing the graffiti to document these kind of testimonies that people were leaving on the walls. That was a really important aesthetic practice as well, that allowed us to communicate with each other in ways that we hadn't really been able to. So people would leave messages on the walls that said, "This is for my father who died 2 weeks after Maria," or things like that were really about sort of people communicating with each other using the walls and graffiti. So those are some of the ways, but I think there's probably more.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. My next questions are for Dr. Villanueva. Joaquin, what do you mean when you say the native elite? Like, who are the native elite?
Yes, that's a great question. That's, I didn't want to get into details about that, but this is like I've been working on a side project also on defining the native elite from the 19th century to the present, and that's like another sort of pet project I have to name them and identify them. But in essence, these are like a group of the most sort of economically and politically powerful individuals that were originally hacendados, so they own land. They participated in the hacienda economy. Eventually, they also participated in the plantation economy when the U.S. Invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, and they've been part of an effort to collaborate. They've been willing to collaborate with imperial governments such as Spain and the U.S. to accommodate themselves and their interests throughout Puerto Rican history, and they've been able to get a handle of Puerto Rican government, of the apparatus of the Puerto Rican government over the years. So we can include in this the native elite. We can include sort of the career politicians, that have been in power for many years. We can also include the most economically dominant individuals in Puerto Rican society that have been able to benefit from the colonial economy by exploiting the local population in many ways. And the native elite has changed over time in many ways, like where they extract wealth. But these are individuals that despite the crisis, right, that we currently are living with, despite the fact that many people are economically struggling, these are individuals that still are benefiting and extracting wealth because they have been able to historically attach themselves to the structures of power. So historically, we see the history of colonies when they gain independence. Usually, the state apparatus was taken over by local native elites, by the local bourgeoisie, as some people have called them. Oftentimes people thought that these native elites would be the one vanguard because they have access to education, that they were able to lead us to independence, right? And we're waiting, and they never been able to, in Puerto Rico, the local elite has never been able to step forward and embrace the project of independence. And so I think what the 2019 protest, just to return to my presentation, demonstrated was, I think, that people say, like, forget about them. We don't need them anymore. And let's take them down, and then we will create our own freedom struggle. We will define our futures. We will define our political imaginaries. And I think that was an important sort of shift, I think, in political struggle.
Thank you so much. My last question for you, Joaquin, is: do you think there is something better on the horizon from Puerto Rico, and if so, what does it look like?
Yes, I mean, we have to know. We have to think that there's something better. Otherwise, why continue, no? And so I don't know, and I think this goes back to a question that José Atiles was addressing at the beginning as well. I think all of us are like pondering about that, what that political future looks like. I don't know, but I will say that the political future, I hope it is queer, I hope it is feminist, I hope it is intersectional, and many other sort of really awesome sort of new identities and expressions that we haven't seen yet, that depart from traditional expressions, political expressions in Puerto Rico. And that's why I really enjoyed seeing the presentation from my colleagues, and seeing, for instance, like Adriana's presentation about the protest, and really seeing sort of these political subjects, and Aurora also highlighted that intersectional aspect of the protesters. I think these are sort of these prefigure what will become the future of Puerto Rico. I mean, I don't know, but I hope that is the future.
Thank you. Now I'm going to read the questions posed by the audience. The first one comes from Samantha Isales. And this question is for Dr. Aurora Santiago Ortiz, but she would like to hear from the other panelists. In your work, how have you seen place influencing people's decision about political issues, statehood, identity, etc.? I know there were specific examples of solidarity during the protest, so maybe in a more general way.
Thank you for that question. what I've seen that has shifted in terms of place, which I think is great, is that people are organizing really locally and shifting from the centralized space of San Juan. And I think, and it's been happening, but I think that with the use of social media, it's also been important because there is that relationship between the virtual and the real and the space, and the physical space. It has allowed people to collaborate across municipalities, across the archipelago. For example, the regional network of mutual aid centers has also emerged as a way to cross-collaborate and share, information. I think that because of technology, organizations can also talk about the issues that are central and share these best practices. I also think about, in terms of space, the occupation of abandoned property is something that is also very important. And it's, re-signifying private property, abandoned property that's tied to inheritance, but no one has claimed, and turning that into spaces that the collective can benefit from, but from a very localized standpoint. So I think that is really important. And I think that the Asambleas de Pueblo, the People's Assemblies, were also important in creating these localized networks of collective meeting in different towns. So that kind of shifted the focus away from always doing things in the capital city of San Juan to doing things that really speak to the local issues that are of concern to people in different towns. So I think that local connection has been really important.
This question, thank you so much. This question was also for the other panelists. Before I move to the next question, do you guys want to address that question too?
Joaquin, I assume you might want to say something.
No, I mean, I was nodding when Aurora was mentioning the spaces of abandonment, and that's something that really interests me here, because one of the sort of main visible effects of the recent crisis, the fiscal financial crisis in Puerto Rico, is the signs of abandonment, and the physical abandonment of buildings and spaces, and sort of you can see it in town centers across Puerto Rico, and these are spaces that suddenly are sort of left unclaimed, but that hold the possibility of transforming relations, spatial relations, social relations, but also hold the possibility of new futures. And I think also going back to what Aurora and Adriana were talking about, how artists have been able to very creatively take those spaces, those places, and redefine political, social relations in significant ways. So I just wanted to show that the particular conditions that Puerto Rico faces are also presenting opportunities, for placemaking and place claiming as well. So,
thank you. The next question is for all the panelists. Did the U.S. ever intervene during the protests of the summer 2019? What was the role they played, if any?
If I might intervene, it depends what do we mean by the U.S. The context of the summer. Former President Trump was very active in Twitter, describing local politicians, especially Rosselló, as he even mentioned that Rosselló was under siege, it was being threatened, and he, used his inflammatory rhetoric to describe the situation or the protests in a way that undermined the importances of the summer. Then, if we think about law enforcement or like police or FBI, we should assume that there was some intervention, there was some monitoring of the situation. Because of the history of colonial history colonial history with surveillance and state crimes in Puerto Rico, so we should assume that. But also, we should think that the whole situation took place very much under the guise of the junta, no, and the federal oversight board. So there were many instances of U.S. intervention or U.S. allowing or even critically engaging in narrating the events to the Republican or right-wing sector of the U.S. population, right, through former Trump's rhetoric. So yeah, there were many interventions, probably not direct, not traditional, but many, I would say. I don't know what Adriana, Aurora, Joaquin think.
All right. Thank you.
Can I say something? Can I say something there? No, I agree, Jose, and I my question is like when I was seeing this question was like, how can you not intervene when you've been there for so long? You know, like if it's so present, like it's so hegemonic, the U.S. presence. Like how can you not intervene somehow? No, so I was thinking, for instance, like even Ricky Rosselló in the middle of the protest appearing on US media to talk, and sort of that interview was seen like by the diaspora, and the role that that interview played in reigniting the protest, you know, and the diaspora also in the US, you know, which is part of the US as well, also being present in social media and talking with family members, that's an intervention. That's a US intervention as well. A complicated one, no? If you want. And also the role of the FBI, you know, in also before and after joining Jose's work, arresting or indicting sort of politicians or former members of cabinet for corruption cases and so forth. You know, sort of just adding to the entire narrative. So I just see, like Jose, like the U.S. intervention is very complicated not to intervene, not in the traditional military sense of sending troops, but the interventions are multiple on multiple levels and scales.
This reminds me. I've been thinking a lot about this. We can't forget that the father of Ricky Rosselló, former governor Pedro Rosselló, many members of his cabinet were also indicted, many of which also served time in federal prison. The next question comes from Angelina Quiles. Historically, we have known artists to use their platforms to influence a particular political agenda that they feel passionate about. How's Puerto Rico's artistic manifestations influencing political movements in the island? And are they short-lived, or is there a continuation via committees and open public forums that take place throughout the year? If so, is there funding for this type of collaborations? And lastly, if there are committees that push this important work forward, is it open to wider audiences or just to Puerto Rico natives?
Thank you very much for the question, Angelina. There is a very lively and interesting art scene in Puerto Rico that includes international artists from places like Argentina, Italy, many others who come to the island for residencies, to do murals, to do performances, to stage plays. So there is not only the local scene is very rich, but there's also a long tradition of exchange with Latin American artists as well as European and North American and artists globally speaking. So you know, I do think it is it's not just a passing situation what I'm describing. You know, in my paper, it's really a richly textured and layered and complicated history that is interwoven with the history of feminism, interwoven with the history of activism, environmentalism, Black Power movements, Pan-Africanist movements, indigenous movements, they're all intertwined with the history of art in Puerto Rico through traditions like el grabado, the printmaking, and many other, of course, music, so many other artistic expressions that are tied up with Puerto Rican history, Puerto Rican culture more broadly, and with that kind of history of international solidarity building. I would say that generally speaking, the arts and artists in Puerto Rico express the desire for decolonization. Different people have different understandings of what that means, but whatever the particular future vision, I think there is a consensus that the colonial situation is inhumane and untenable and must end. And a lot of Puerto Rican art deals with the consequences of the ongoing colonial situation on multiple levels. So I think that there's a lot of collaboration. The funding is limited, but there is increasingly interest in Puerto Rican arts, and some big grants through some universities have opened up recently, and there are a few museums in Puerto Rico that have community programs and that create that sustain exhibitions and programming for local communities, including for youth. So definitely there's opportunities if you're interested. There's going to be definitely opportunities for you, and you should check out Beta Local, which is an organization in Old San Juan that is kind of like an arts incubator. And there are many others. There's also Casa Ruth in Rio Piedra. So if you look around, you'll find that there are many opportunities to collaborate in a very, very lively art scene that loves to receive artists from outside of Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much. This question is to all panelists. What other transnational or global protest movements we could productively compare Puerto Rico protests to, if any? Or any forms of global solidarity that inform protest in Puerto Rico? I haven't answered any question, but I'd like to go ahead and start on answering this one. The first thing that comes to mind is the protest between in 2014 and 15 in Venezuela, that were an accumulation of different processes that started during the Hugo Chavez administration and continued, and the situation got worse during the Maduro administration. Those protests were very interesting to see, in part because the part that compares to Puerto Rico also is that the people that were more vocal leading the protests were students in Venezuela, many of which were incarcerated. Many people, thousands of people have disappeared during the political dictatorship. So that's the first one that comes to mind when in answering that question. Thank you.
I wanted to follow up, and very similar to what Dr. Garriga-López described in terms of transnational networks among artists, I think that also among social movements or political organizations, and for example, La Colectiva is part of wider networks of feminist organizations in Latin America. They have strong ties to Argentina and reproductive justice activists over there. Also in Uruguay, they participate in international campaigns for decriminalizing abortion. For example, they participate in international, even WhatsApp chats, and share protest tactics and strategies. They're part of La Internacional as well. So like they are also going to conferences. They're also participating in all sorts of spaces where they can have these communication networks with other activists as well. So that's just one example. And I think that and also like as the Arab Spring and Occupy as also being sort of previous infrastructures as well, that people from the Puerto Rican diaspora, for example, with Occupy, have participated and camped out in Zuccotti Park and were there, and then came back to Puerto Rico and actually have done anti-colonial organizing or have been part of initiatives like Libros Libres, which is a community like library that is spread all over Puerto Rico. So that's just one example, or participating in movements in Catalunya as well, and in Podemos. So I think there has been a cross-pollination of strategies. And of course, some people might say Hong Kong as well as another example that maybe one of you would like to take up as well. So I think, yes, there is definite communication and sharing of strategies and also transnational linkages in terms of that.
Just very quickly follow up that, and not Hong Kong necessarily, but I wanted to give a shout out to the work of Sara Wartani, who she has written a lot about the transnational solidarities between Puerto Rico and Palestine. And so the Palestinian struggle, and even during the protest, there was a lot of solidarity networks that were formed, sort of sharing similar colonial struggles between the two nations. So that's one, but also wanted to put it in the wider context of the Caribbean. As a region that is facing very similar issues, from having to deal with debt, natural hazards, and the corruption of the political class as well. And so we saw also in the Caribbean in the years prior and after Puerto Rican protests, also drawing from the Puerto Rican example and also drawing from examples in the Caribbean about similar struggles, right? So we're in constant conversation, and even during the current debt crisis, there's been a lot of exchange, and networks and spaces formed to talk about how do we deal with the question of debt, how do we deal with the question of reparations, how do we deal with the question of hurricanes, earthquakes, and so forth, right? So there's been many opportunities for these conversations across many regions in the world.
Thank you. This question is for all the panelists, including myself. There are many Puerto Ricans living in the United States and all over the world, many of which are scholars, and that is our case. We live in the United States, in my case, for 20 years now. How do you feel about this? That is, being part of the diaspora. And do you see a future where you can go back to Puerto Rico? Why is that so hard to answer?
Whose question is this? Who's
That's
asking this question?
Huh? Mine is mine.
Ah,
I am
no,
asking that question.
Es que tú quieres sacar la herida a pasear, entonces. No, that's too tough, Elvin. I don't know if I'm ready to answer that one. I want to hear what Atiles' answer to the next question. I'm gonna pass.
Well, actually, I wanted to go back to the question about the global protests, but because even though that I'm not thinking about similarities in terms of solidarity between these movements, but it's really interesting that at the same time that Puerto Rico was experiencing the summer of 2019, Haiti was having a very similar set of demonstration, and Lebanon, Beirut. And obviously we will have to be really careful of comparing the social, political, and economic situation in Haiti, Beirut, and Puerto Rico. They are completely unique in their own, but we can see some similarities when it comes to anti-corruption demonstrations or protests against systemic abandonment, or against the lack, or against the consequence of austerity and long-lasting economic crisis or long-lasting economic stagnation. And even though that I don't know if there is solidarities, is something really interesting to look at. I don't have an answer, but I think there are connections that need to be explored, or connection that need to be made. About the question about being part of the diaspora, I just started being part of the diaspora, so I will let my colleagues to take it.
Well, I want to say something about the global protest question too, because nobody's mentioned the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, which for me were really fundamental. And I was thinking about Egypt and Cairo when I was at the protests in the summer of 2019. I was remembering how oh, I didn't hear about Aurora mention that. I missed that. I was kind of struck several times while I was at the protests by my memory of watching the live stream from Egypt for days on end and being so moved and overwhelmed by what I was witnessing. And then, of course, the failures and frustrations that came after that. And in a way, it was kind of a cautionary tale for us, and in with very different cultural, political, historical arrangements, but with similar dynamics around the afterlife of the protest, right? What happens after the protest and how do forces get reorganized, and hegemonic power kind of finds its way back into the structural position of domination, which is what has happened. We have the same party back in power, So I think that resonance is perhaps weaker because there's more. I mean, we're talking about 2011, right? So it's a long time in between. But I think for me, politically, that was definitely one of the ghosts that was kind of present at the protest, was the Egyptian revolution.
Thank you. The next question comes from Santos Rivera Cardona. Dr. Atiles Osoria mentions two important symbols during the hashtag Wanda Renuncia, the guillotine and the 4,645. What could we say about the use and presence of the black and white flag as a symbol since 2016 and its broad use during and since the summer of 2019? Any specific meaning we can give to this symbol, mourning or resistance? Lastly, how can we explain the use of this symbol during or since the summer of 2019? Does it mean that it goes beyond political and discursive communities, colonialistas or estadistas or soberanistas, and serves as a unifying one? We even saw the black and white flag during the 2021 storming of the US Capitol.
So thank you, Santos, for your question. I think the symbols are really important, and I'm not sure. I think at some point I heard Adriana make the history or tell the story of the white and black or the mourning flag. I'm not sure, but I know that it was an initiative that that a group of artists took in Old San Juan, Viejo San Juan, in where they painted over a door in one of the San Juan street. And yeah, it has become a symbol of mourning and resistance. And I think we can see that as well with the guillotines. What is interesting is that at the context of Wandalismo or Wanda Renuncia, the guillotine didn't symbol. It was really interesting, right? Seeing the guillotine, because it has a very Eurocentric and very kind of imperial past. However, in the colonial context, I think it had kind of a decolonial, kind of a critical critical context that we should not associate necessarily with the French Revolution and the French context. But I don't know if Adriana would like to weigh in, or Joaquin or Aurora. Thank you so much, Santos.
I mean, I can just, Adriana, you want to say something? Yeah, just wanted to follow up very quickly, saying that I mean, as as I see like Aurora's background there in the back, the flag, and I think this question comes up often. We always ask, is this for mourning or resistance? And I always wonder, why do we ask that question? Why does it have to be either or? And I'm always very struck at the ambivalence about this flag. And it's both, because we're grieving, we're mourning, we are constantly mourning by the loss of people due to multiple crises, and we're resisting that. We're resisting that particular structures that are killing us in multiple ways. No, so I think that flag has a lot of weight, precisely because it's not either or, but it's both at the same time, right? So just want to put out there.
Yeah, thank you, Joaquin and Jose, for that. About the guillotine, I love the guillotine. I'm not sure it's a symbol. There was a guillotine that was like made of cardboard, and it was obviously fake. But then there was another one that was looking pretty real. I don't know. And there was a sense in the crowd that we really could break through those police barriers. So I'm not sure. I mean, you could give it a symbolic reading, but there might also be a material reading there. And so I appreciate Aurora putting in the chat sort of, her answer to Elvin's question, and Joaquin kind of suggesting one there also. I guess I would say I consider myself an exile in a way, and I'm not sure if I'll ever have the chance to return. I hope that I can. I didn't want to answer the question just because it's so painful to talk about it, and I'm afraid I might start crying. But I hope that I can return. I would like to find a way to return. My family is all in Puerto Rico, and I don't know if it'll be possible though. So I have to find a way to live a Puerto Rican life regardless. Wherever I am, if I'm in Michigan or somewhere else, I'm still a Puerto Rican living this life, and I'm still going to maintain my connections to my family, to my friends, to the islands, and that's one of the most important things in my life. So what is return? I mean, we're constantly returning. I can't wait to return. I haven't been back since the pandemic started, so I'm looking forward to the next return, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. Will I be able to make it permanently? I don't know. But what do you do with that uncertainty other than just keep trying to keep trying to be part of the family, keep trying to be part of the conversation of the, keep worrying over the same problems together, from wherever you're doing that, and that's some kind of way of being a part of it. It's not always satisfying, but.
Adriana, thank you. If I if I brought the question, I think the minimum I can do is try to answer it. It is a difficult question to answer, and in part, I think I ask because that's something that I've always struggled with. I've been, like I said, been living in the United States for 20 years. When I left Puerto Rico, I thought it was going to be just for a quick thing I was doing. First it was an internship, then it was the master's, then it was the PhD. Next thing I know, it's been 20 years. And one thing that I noticed is that it is always my hope to be back. I just don't know how to construct it. I always struggle now because I try to provide a Puerto Rican experience to my daughters. The music that we listen, the food that we eat, I try to replicate the smells, and I try to replicate the food. And I mean, it's difficult to answer.
You did it to yourself there that time, Elvin.
I know, but it is something that I always think about that. How can we go back? How can we contribute? I feel that as as a geographer, I always try to think of myself as a global citizen that goes beyond the geography and the space and place. But deep inside, it's Puerto Rico always.
And I just wanted to have, we were lucky, Jarell and I, to have that, because the day that Ricky resigned, we were in Mexico, and Joaquin was there too, and other Puerto Ricans. And if we did not have other Puerto Ricans around us, it would have not been a great experience, in the sense we really wanted to share that with other people from Puerto Rico. And it was late at night though. Everybody was asleep or trying to go to sleep. But the next day, just being with other Puerto Ricans, it didn't matter the space, as you said, like it was just such a joy to be able to share that moment with other Puerto Ricans in Mexico. So
I was in Puerto Rico. I was lucky in the sense that I was in Puerto Rico during the protest, and Ricky announced his stepping down during my birthday, July 24th. So that was the best birthday present ever. There is, let's see. Okay, so Puerto Rico's civil unrest has forced a new wave of social consciousness and has shifted to a younger audience as the main agents of change, who have strongly demanded systemic change. Do you find that there is also a shift within the older generations that have been committed generationally to their party's agenda? That's a great question.
I think I can get started if anybody wants to jump in. Feel free. There's a general crisis, I think, in the electoral party system in Puerto Rico, and that includes really all the political parties. Uh, Due to recent legal decisions, congressional action, the action of Promesa, and several other circumstances, there's just not as much solid ground for these parties to consolidate their bases on, and so they've lost a great part of the electorate. Just has stopped voting, and there's a lot of doubt about how things are going to be reorganized. That is just kind of like, we're not sure. That's happening right now. But the influence of the religious sector is really significant in the question that you ask about, especially the older generations. It used to be the case that people were really really voting along party lines, and that especially among older folks, and that has shifted a little bit. And we've seen, for example, the creation of a new party based on religious ideology. And so people seem willing to move in different directions based on, fundamentalist ideas or the rejection of the kind of parties that have gone into crisis or that have been involved in extensive corruption. There's some movement around that, but there's still quite a bit of tribalism around, especially the pro-statehood party and the status quo party, the PPD. So that is probably going to have to just die out with the generations. But even for old folks, I think the experience of Hurricane Maria and the sort of breakdown of the political structure in Puerto Rico has resulted in more movement around, electoral choices. But there's a general disenfranchisement, and there's a general disaffection from the electoral process. And that's clearly shown by the very low levels of voter participation.
Thank you so much. Jose or Aurora or Joaquin, would you like to answer that? Now we're getting to the end of the panel.
Just very quick, just wanted to add that for me the reference for me as my parents, as thinking about the generational shift, and even though they still vote along party lines, even though I've always tried to lure them otherwise, I've seen changes in the way they sort of think about certain issues. I've seen sort of their ideas changing a little bit, not the electoral practices, but at least in discussions. And I think certainly after Maria, but Maria compounded with the debt crisis, and my parents both received pensions, so their pensions are being cut by the Fiscal Control Board or threatened to cut them. All that I think is really, you have to fundamentally rethink your political relationships. And for some people, that's a little bit easier to do, and because they have party alliance. But for people that have party alliance, it's a little bit difficult to sort of shift. But I think there's been a change in the narrative and the questions and the demands that people expect from the government.
All right, now, thank you so much. Now I'm gonna ask Hope or Volha to take us and finish the panel.
Well, I just wanted to do a final thank you to everybody. This has been a really enlightening conversation. So many things to think about. A lot of the ideas about comparison, thinking about how we resist in different contexts and how there's so much that's shared and how those differences and how those are important as well. Volha, did you want to add anything? Oh, you're muted.
I was just like saying that I'm in awe with you guys. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your conviction, your determination, and your vulnerabilities with us. It was one of the best panels I have ever dreamt of organizing. Thank you, Hope, and the Museum of Culture and Environment. And thank you so much, Elvin, for organizing and bringing this speakers to CW and to Central Washington. And hopefully maybe we can do this in person sometime.
Yes. Yes, that would be wonderful. Absolutely. Yes, and of course, final thank you to Elvin for bringing everyone together. Wonderful. Yes, real applause.
Thank you to Joaquin, Aurora, and Adriana and Jose. I know I haven't had the pleasure and honor to meet Aurora or Adriana and Jose in person. I hope sometime in the near future I'm able to do that. And thank you, Joaquin, for helping me, because he's the person who put me in contact with them. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.